So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending where you are. Just a formal sentence during the presentation. Maybe if you can have your microphone off and do not hesitate to write questions in the chat. This time it's working. We'll have time for questions after the presentation of Edward. So thank you to all of you for having joined us tonight, another time for the next session of Yahadi Nunum online conference program entitled Beyond Memory. After having a fascinating discussion last week between Avi Benlolo and Father Patrick Desbois about contemporary anti-Semitism, tonight we will have the opportunity to learn more about a very original topic, the question of the consumption of alcohol by Nazis in camps, ghettos, and during killing operations in Eastern occupied territory especially. Dr. Edward Westermann, our guest, will explain us why the consumption of alcohol was a common practice among perpetrators when they have to deal with the victims, how it became a routine during the violence, how the alcohol and ritual celebration had an impact on the behavior and the motivation of the killers during their crimes, and many other issues. So the topic is very familiar to Yahad researchers who are connected here. In our collection of 7,000 testimonies, we have several hundreds of testimonies of witnesses who remembers Germans, local policemen being drunk during mass killings, especially of Jews or Roma, and the celebrations after the killings. Moreover, in a larger sense, the consumption of psychotropic or psychoactive substances by perpetrators is also relevant not only during the Holocaust, but also during other mass violences and genocides. For instance, during the armed conflict in Guatemala, I'm not sure you know, but we are also investigating in Guatemala about the armed conflict and especially about the massacres of Maya. We hear often from Mayan survivors about a certain euphoria of drunk soldiers committing killings. In Iraq and Syria, where we had interviewed hundreds of victims of ISIS, we could also notice testimonies of Yazidi survivors about the common use of drugs by ISIS soldiers. So this is also why we are very, very curious and impatient at Yahadi Nunum to listen you, Edward, about your hypothesis, about your conclusions, about the consumption of psychoactive substances by perpetrators, the impact on them, and the role of the celebrations. I will let now my colleague Albert Hitri to introduce as our guest of tonight. Edward, thank you again for having accepted to be a part of this online program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone. So I tried to make the introduction very short because I think we are all really thrilled to get today some insights of the new work of Edward Westermann. As a scholar, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you today to Edward Westermann because without knowing it, he, or should I say, his works crossed my research several times. And so Westermann received his PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's a Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M University San Antonio, and he is the author of Hitler's Police Battalions Enforcing Racial War in the East, and Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars, Comparing Genocide and Conquest. He has been a Fulbright Fellow, a German Academic Exchange Service Fellow on 3 occasions, and a Fellow at the Keene State College Genocide Studies and Genocide Prevention Program. Last year in spring, he was a Maurice C. and J.B. Shapiro Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And yeah, today he will be speaking about his forthcoming book, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany. That is forthcoming with Cornell University Press in association with the United States Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in March 2021. So we have the great luck today to get some insights of the book. And yeah, Edward, the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both. And I would like to thank all the people at YHAD. It's a great organization that does great work and important testimony. I would also note that the idea partially for this project came from Father Dubois' The Holocaust by Bullets, when I first read it, and I was struck by some of his descriptions of the witnesses. So it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to be back here and to talk about this. I'm going to start by showing what appears to be relatively mundane photos. If you look at the front of this presentation, on the left, this is Police Battalion 101, made famous as an organization in Chris Browning's book, Ordinary Men. This is Christmas of 1940. And at this time, the battalion was stationed at Łódź at the ghetto. And on the left, they're celebrating Christmas, and that would be a normal type of celebration you would expect drinking. However, the photo on the right, I think, gets to something that's a little bit more important. What you see is they had skits during the celebration, and this skit is showing what is purportedly a Jewish man who's been caught smuggling with his basket. And you have the three policemen who are around him smiling, and they've apprehended him. Now, what you would need to understand is that for the prior month, this battalion has been involved in stopping smuggling in and out of the ghetto, and has made liberal use of their weapons in killing those involved. And so to include a skit that makes fun of your activities that involve murder in the ghetto, I think gives us, that is a real insight into the way these men kind of conceptualized their celebration. And as we go further, as I began this project, there was a number of things that I was interested in thinking about. And the first one was, what role did alcohol and drinking rituals play among the perpetrators? How did they use alcohol? What were some of the reasons that they drank? And how did it play a role in their activities? As I was looking at this, one of the things that was very clear is there's a metaphorical intoxication. In other words, those who go to the East as colonizers also have the power over life and death in those areas. And in a sense, they have this metaphorical power, but they also use alcohol as a way to have a literal intoxication. And as I continued in the research, one of the things that became clear to me was that conceptions of masculinity were tied into the ideal of the perpetrators, their self-image, the way they saw themselves, and that this ideal of masculinity, along with drinking, became tied to acts of physical and sexual violence, and ultimately mass murder. And as was talked about earlier, this idea of celebratory ritual and how celebrations became framed as part of the acts of mass murder really, in my mind, give us major insights on the perpetrators themselves. One of the toughest issues in dealing with a subject like alcohol is it's not just a historicized issue. In other words, one has to look at social science literature, and there's a great deal of social science literature that looks at things like alcohol, aggression, sexual violence. One has to look at the literature of psychology. Robert Lifton's own work on the Nazi doctors is one example of that. Sociology as well, especially for things like perceptions of masculinity. There's a social and cultural placement of alcohol. In other words, not every culture uses alcohol or even uses alcohol at all in the same ways. So it's important to put the context of drinking and drinking ritual into this historical study. And drinking ritual in Western Europe and drinking ritual in Eastern Europe, there are some differences, and we can talk a little bit about that. The other area that's important to look at is this also crosses into the medical and physiological effects, especially of large-scale alcohol use that one saw in the East. And then later, I'll talk about some specific roles and functions as we move forward. But I'd like to start by talking about some definitions, which I think are important, because I introduce this idea, I talk about the importance of masculinity, and many others from sociology have done this. Thomas Kuhne has done this in his own work. And it's a socially constructed idea that exists in relation to this opposite construction of a female ideal. Now, if you look at the current literature, or much of the current literature uses the term hegemonic masculinity, this dominant form of masculinity. And in looking at masculinity, it's a malleable concept. In other words, it's not static, it does change. However, I agree with hegemonic masculinity, but when I look at my perpetrators, I believe that when we look at the Third Reich, the hypermasculinity is an important concept. And what I mean by that is there's a sex and race are entwined with perceptions of masculinity that are also further entwined with what's known as militarized masculinity and acts of performative masculinity. And I'll return to that discussion a little bit later in the presentation. This is you're getting to see my first quote from the book publicly here. So this is a way for you to understand that this is the way, for example, when I'm looking at hypermasculinity, how I link that term with ideas of German manhood that are tied again to ideas of sexuality, racism, and militarization. And when we look at Western conceptions of masculinity, so both Western European and United States conceptions of masculinity, there's very much a belief in the ability of a man to, quote, hold his liquor. And one sees that this is, as you go into the social science literature, that this is anchored in that literature, these ideas of how the ability to consume a great amount of alcohol distinguishes one from one's other male peers, and with greater consumption equaling greater masculinity. Now, this was also the case in Germany in the 19th century and into the 20th century. And I have a quote here by Alfred Rosenberg, who was obviously the ideologue of the Nazi Party, and he is, in an article, he was reacting critically to this. In other words, he wants to change that perception. But the fact that he acknowledged that that was the perception, I think, is an important thing. So the endurance at the bar, or the Biertisch, serving as a record of masculine upbringing. And certainly there are regional manifestations of, do the Frisians, can they hold their liquor better than the Bavarians? And that's tied into some regional identity as well. Looking at alcohol in masculinity and then tying it to aggression is a key part of this discussion as well. And we know, again, from social science literature that there's a direct connection between drinking, perceptions of masculinity, and use of violence. And if you look at the bottom quote here from Susan Jeffords, where she talks about these links to excessive alcohol use as a demonstration of what she calls performative masculinity. And again, she links that concept to both physical and sexual violence. If we also go a little bit deeper and look at what sexual violence and alcohol are, how they're related, one can also, the sociologist Peggy Sandy Reeves has looked at what we in the United States call university fraternities. And they are famed, just like the Burschenschaften of the 19th century, for lots of drinking, but they're also very much intertwined, their identity, with these masculine perceptions. And that ties to sexuality as well. And in her study of these fraternities, what she found is that acts of gang rape or mass rape are very much performative on the one sense for the individual, but they also exist in relationship to one another, to the group of men who are involved, and act as a form of male bonding and allegiance to the social group. Now, where this is important when we look at the Nazi context is that we see the same dynamic in the killing fields, in the ghettos, and in the concentration camps, especially in the East. And the idea, the use of gang rapes, the use of communal drinking, especially as identifying this allegiance to the group, but also to the group's activities. So earlier I said I was going to talk a little bit about roles and functions of alcohol, and these are all integrated into the book manuscript. But I don't think it's any surprise for anyone who drinks that we use drinking as social bonding and for celebration. I think that's a normal function. That drinking in the East, for example, or at least in the Nazi context, I will talk about how fellowship evenings are an important part of building this kind of male camaraderie, how the locations in which drinking take place also influence what drinking means. So in the Kneipe or the bar or the canteen in the concentration camps, we'll talk a little bit about that. And that competitions, this idea of performative masculinity, the linkage between competitions in various forms, I'll look at that as well. I've already talked about this linkage between alcohol, masculinity, and violence. The selective disinhibition term, it's what I tell my students in the United States is the spring break effect. And what I mean by that is when you go on vacation, you do things that you wouldn't have done if you hadn't been drinking, for example. The idea that drinking allows you sometimes to cross a threshold that you would not otherwise cross. In the case of Nazi Germany, one sees that in some of the killing units with the murder of children or the murder of women, where drinking serves as a way for the perpetrators to get beyond that inhibition. However, I think that this next item, facilitation, is actually a pretty fascinating item when you talk about drinking, because what we see is that drinking is also used as a way, in some cases, to generate violence. And so it prompts new acts of violence. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And for those familiar with the topic, it's certainly important to understand that the Nazis used alcohol as an incentive and a reward for acts of violence. And we can talk about that maybe if some of the questions get there. And the last function is a coping mechanism. And I think that this is probably the most widely known, and in the historiography, the most widespread discussion of alcohol as a coping mechanism. And by the end of this, I'll talk a little bit about what I think with respect to that. Now, just to give you an idea of what the actual book covers, it covers this idea of alcohol and masculinity, but it also looks at rituals of humiliation, which extend into the concentration camps before the war, but also into the East, into the ghettos. And these rituals of humiliation by the perpetrators are not always associated with drinking, but they are rituals associated with the intoxication of power over others. And so we see in many cases some of the metaphorical intoxication that ties this control over other subjects. Taking trophies and hunting Jews is another chapter, and it looks at the art of trophy taking, the practice of trophy taking by the perpetrators. And in hunting, staged hunts, for example, and what one would see from the literature, if we looked at, for example, anthropology or sociology, that hunting is very much a practice that is imbued with masculinity and masculine virtues. So I explore that. Alcohol and sexual violence is a topic that a number of female historians have done path-breaking work with. I could mention Regina Mulhäuser, Birgit Beck. I could talk about Rochelle Seidel. Elena Sinreich as well. There are a number who have done this, but what one also sees is the integration of alcohol into this type of violence as well. Celebrating murder, and this is, Michel talked about this, when one sees the use of kind of a carnival-like or a festive scenery that's associated with some of these acts, that gives us further insight into the nature of the acts. And the 6th chapter looks at ethnic auxiliaries, so Schutzmannschaften, for example, local policemen in the East, the Trodnikis as well, and talks about their use of alcohol. And then finally, the final chapter looks at the German army as its own organization and its own use of alcohol. The quote that I have here, I just want to highlight a portion of it. Omer Bartov's latest book, The Anatomy of Genocide, where he looks at Buchach and what happens in the town over the course of its existence. It's really striking that he has this quote where he talks about the normalization of murder, the removal of Jews as part of a day's work, entertainment as background noise to drinking bouts or amorous relationship. And he goes on to say this was part and parcel of the German experience of genocide, but it's rarely reflected in post-war representations, let alone in the historiography. And I think Omer's right that it has been underrepresented in the historiography, but where I think he's wrong, or he can be corrected, is that there are many, many examples of the use of alcohol. In fact, when one starts looking for it, it's surprising how often one then recognizes it or finds it. So there's quite a bit, as Michel says, in the case of the Jihad testimonies, right? 300 testimonies, that gives one an idea. In starting to look at the Third Reich and alcohol use by the perpetrators, actually, we have to start before the creation of the Third Reich, because the stormtroopers or the SA kind of create what I would call a template that is used to pretty much an organizational manifestation of masculinity is created in this case of that organization. It involves drinking. It involves the creation of camaraderie. It involves acts of performative masculinity. And one of the most surprising things that it involved as I got deeper into this project was the use of music and song in very much a directed way, oftentimes in very much an aggressive way against putative enemies, but also to build consensus among the group. And then that these SA Heime or SA pubs, Kneipen, also become centers for political organization, but also they become centers in which individual members and groups go out and conduct political violence against their putative enemies. So this already starts before actually Hitler takes power. And I think there's been quite a bit of work or some work on looking at music in the Third Reich. George Massey, for example, looked at some of this. But the impression that contemporaries had of the power of that music, and even the impression that former Hitler youth, when they reflect back on the organization, talk about music and song, its impression is something I think that's important to recognize. And then, as Christopher Dillon's excellent book, Dachau and the SS, talks about how in these group settings, alcohol use and heavy drinking was used as a way to stage these kind of punitive expeditions. That is something I think that is a red thread that runs throughout the experience of Nazi Germany. One of the, I guess, paradoxes of a regime that has many paradoxes is that if you're an alcoholic, or you're deemed an alcoholic in Nazi Germany, you risk imprisonment, you can be sent to concentration camps, or in the case of about 20 to 30,000 individuals who are deemed chronic alcoholics, they were forcibly sterilized for alcoholism itself. And from Himmler's perspective, the head of the SS and the police, alcohol is not to be used as an inebriant. It's not to be used as a way to lose control. He talks about, for SS and police units, that it's to be used as social bonding. So for example, when he talks about after killing actions, fellowship evenings, he talks about limiting drinking to 1/2 liter or 1 liter of beer. He talks about singing and poetry being incorporated into these after killing events in order to kind of make sure that these SS and policemen don't lose their quote unquote moral compass. And this quote by Richard Breitman gets exactly to how Himmler viewed, or what he wanted, his ideal. Now, what we're going to see is that that ideal that Himmler had was in no means accepted by those in the SS and police, especially those in the camps and those sent to the east. And if we look at the concentration camps themselves, some of the elements that we find is rituals of humiliation are tied to the perpetrator's power over the individuals, violence and amusement here. And what many survivors of the camps talk about is they talk about the amusement taken, or the joy taken, by some of the perpetrators and the types of activities they subject their victims to. And I think that that's a very important term, amusement, or that they saw the guards saw it as quote sport. So we see competition between guards, guards who compete against others to beat prisoners more thoroughly is one example. Murder games, probably the most well-known murder game in the camps is the throwing of an inmate's cap across a line and then ordering the inmate to try to pick it up and then shooting the inmate for quote shot while trying to escape. So we see the integration of these types of games. Now, sometimes this is associated with alcohol. For example, if we look at Dachau, there are these nightly raids that the SS guards do into the barracks, and they're drunk guards. And what they decide to do is they decide to leave the canteen to go into the camp and to abuse the prisoners, right? We also see in other camps and other places where guards at night have been drinking in the SS canteen and bring in prisoners into the canteen and make them perform exercises, make them perform humiliating types of acts, right? So again, we see some of this this linkage between this physical and psychological control, but also the use of alcohol in that process. And the quote that I have here again underlines kind of some of the humiliation and the dehumanization that's experienced by some of those who are in the camps. Rudolf Höss, in his own death row memoir, I think this quote is really interesting. He said, from his career in the SS and in the camps, he said, the SS guards, looked upon flogging of prisoners as a welcome spectacle, a kind of entertainment. And what one sees is this kind of creation of entertainment or sport for the guards. This is not only in the camps, it's in the ghettos that one sees this as well. It's also in the killing fields that one can see this. Now, I think that this primary source of this excerpt that I have for you, dealing with an action in a Polish ghetto on New Year's Eve, 1942, very much gets to the facilitation aspect that I talked about with alcohol. So as you look at this quote, one sees that probably the most important thing on this quote is it's New Year's Eve, 1942. So what has been happening is these SS men have been celebrating, they've been drinking. And now at the turn of the year, they decide they want to do something. And what's the way that they decide they want to do something? What do they want to do? Well, the first thing they want to start off the new year with is by going into the ghetto and going on a killing spree. So we have these inebriated SS men going into the ghetto. And as you see, the witness, the survivor, talks about it as these Gestapo men killed lots of people, quote, as a sport, right? The entertainment element of that. And that's one, that's certainly one example. I have several, obviously numerous in the book, but this is a similar example, but it's again tied to a concept I talked about earlier of hunting. And here with the Grodno ghetto, we have an SS Lieutenant Kurt Wiesel who loved to, quote, love to have a good time. And one method of his entertainment would be to go into the ghetto with his friends and organize a, quote, hunt for Jewish girls and boys. And again, one sees the performative aspect of masculinity here. One sees the facilitation of alcohol in leading to this kind of violence. There's another case here that I have for the Warsaw Ghetto that gets to a very similar example where an SS man, Josef Blusha, who would regularly go into the ghetto, and he was there to make a little ruckus, a remi-demi, and to shoot a, quote, couple of Jews. And what he would do is he would literally hide in doorways, hide in entrances to buildings, and set up waiting for a Jew to cross his path, in which case then he would shoot those individuals. You have cases of SS men riding the rickshaws in ghettos like Warsaw and using that rickshaw as a platform to shoot into apartments in the ghetto as well. So sometimes this is tied to alcohol use, sometimes this is tied to the entertainment or the power of the perpetrator. When we talk about Warsaw, this is the Kochmalna bar, which is named for the street outside, one of the streets outside the ghetto. And what you'd probably be immediately see on the lower left-hand corner is there's a light fixture in this police bar. This is a police bar for the ghetto. And the police battalion 61 has put up a Star of David, a very cynical, cynical kind of what Rudolf Weber called Prussian humor in his testimony aspect. And if we were to turn around from that bar and look towards the room, what we would see is that this bar is decorated with murals that have been put up by the policemen themselves. And those murals, as you might be able to see, demonstrate the policemen in their interactions with the Jews of the ghetto. And one of those murals, for example, shows a policeman with his rifle aimed at the back of a Jew who's reaching down to pick up a potato. And so they're celebrating in this bar, they're celebrating their activities. And the first thing you would notice in going into this bar was the door, because when you went into that door, what you would see is notches in groups of 5 that eventually numbered 500. And those notches represented a victim for the policemen of that PB61 that they had killed in the ghetto. So the entry into the bar is exactly performative masculinity competition amongst the members is already then displayed. And their celebration amongst those murals is one aspect. The murder banquets, and this comes actually from Father Dubois' a book, The Holocaust by Bullets, the idea that perpetrators would sit sometimes and eat and drink at the sites of their murder and literally have banquets and sometimes include song or music at those banquets. This is one thing that I think is a difficult thing to understand for any normal person, because perhaps some of you have seen The Act of Killing, which is a movie that deals with the killing of Indonesian communists. And one of the perpetrators who's interviewed in that film is at the murder scene where these communists were killed. And he talks about as he would kill the individuals, he demonstrates how he would do it. And he said the smell was terrible because of the blood. So he talks about devising a new way to do it so there's not so much blood. Well, if you look at some of the testimony of some of the perpetrators, they also talk about the scent, the smell that's at these sites, something we don't normally consider, not only the site, the gruesomeness, but the smell themselves. And then to think about the physiological barrier that one has to overcome to eat at those sites. Again, the normalization of murder, I think, is one of the things that one can draw in that as well. And in some cases, The normalization of that murder also includes women, where men themselves, policemen or SS men, are performing, or Nazi administrators are performing for women by killing. One kind of gruesome example that I can give you is of a policeman who returns to his barracks after a killing action, and he's still covered with the blood and brain matter of some of his victims. And he walks into the head office because there's a secretary that he likes, and he wants to impress her by literally coming back to show his toughness and his hardness with the remains of those who he has killed on his boots and on his uniform blouse. So again, we start to see as well that even some of those who are involved in these killing describe some of the killing in terms of it was loud, just like a carnival. A Volksfest is the word used by the police witness in this case. And this also comes out in Yiddish as well, that some of the survivors, the Horbansprach, talk about Aktion, but they also talk about weddings. In other words, the killings are described as weddings. And I think that's extremely important, the use of that term by some of the witnesses, because it gets to the nature of how they were perceiving the actions of those involved. And that's something that the book also looks at in depth at. If we look at this idea of sexual violence, in some cases, it's related to acts of sexual humiliation and sexual beating. We see this in this example of SD men or Sicherheitsdienst members who force men and women, especially through a gauntlet, and beat them with dog whips. And one of the areas that I think is very clear is the use of flogging or whipping is prevalent in the camps we know about, but it's also used in the East. And it's a process of dehumanization, as we know from US history, and we think about the American South, we think about slavery. In this case, you can draw parallels between how that practice is used by perpetrators against others. But we also see that despite, this Nazi prohibition, this Rassenschande or racial defilement, that sexual assault by SS and police members is prevalent. And Regina Mulheiser in her work has the one estimate that over 50% of SS and policemen are involved in the act of of sexually assaulting so-called racially undesirable women. The source that I have here, though, is from Ruth Elias, who was in Auschwitz. And she was a young girl who was in Block 6. That also was the block that housed the camp orchestra. And so in her outtake for Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, she talks about this. And in her memoir, she talks about what happened. And she writes, first of all, the SS men, woke up the orchestra and the music had to play. And then they started to climb up looking for nice women and take them out. The girls had to sleep with them. The girls were screaming, and that was terrible. Now, in her memoir, she talks about that these are drunk SS men who come at night. And what's really, I think, interesting about this, as horrific as it is that they first want music. And she says, quote, the music had to play. So they are, in essence, they are forming a scene for themselves. They are creating an environment for these sexual assaults that goes beyond just the act itself. And I think that that is a very telling statement into the minds of those perpetrators. And what we also see, I think, that gives us an insight into the minds of perpetrators is their use, for example, of killing games. This is especially horrific in a number of horrific examples, but the idea of performative masculinity, the ability of a man to throw a child into the tree at exactly the right angle and with enough speed to crack the skull of a child. And then the reward for this is not only the accolades of those you're performing this act with, but a glass of schnapps to drink. We also see this in an especially notorious case, Hans Pinokowski here, who created a geometrical game. This is where he killed one Jew, asked two Jews to then bury him, killed those two, had four Jews come up, had them bury the two Jews, and he continued this numbers game until he had single-handedly murdered over 200 men. Now, in this case, Penkovsky actually is going to be punished for this with a week of house arrest. And he's punished because he's wasting Jewish labor at a time in which Jewish labor is needed by the Nazis. But a week of house arrest in which he orders the Jewish council to bring him a bottle of schnapps every day during his house arrest. What we also see in celebrating is that perpetrators who keep count and argue amongst one another who has the most victims. So sitting down after an action, those who have competed against one another and kept count, again, very much a performative marker of masculinity. This is actually an incident that I described in my very first article for Holocaust and Genocide Studies on this topic. But the German House, a restaurant bar, is a German administrator is about to go in, and he hears this loud singing, this party that's going on in the bar. And as he's opening the door, he has an SS man coming out, and the SS man has a beer coaster that's pinned to his blouse with the number 1000 in red ink. And when he asks him what's going on, the SS or the Gestapo man tells him, "Man, today I'm celebrating my 1000th killing, Knickschuss," right? So this celebration, all right, of a celebration in public spaces of reaching this number goal, I think again offers insight. We see also a very similar aspect of this when we look at the T4 euthanasia program. In the case of Grafenik, which the quote refers to here, there's a party for this SS man, Josef Oberhauser, after his 20,000th burning. So he's celebrating reaching that milestone. We also see that at Treblinka, where after the deportations from Warsaw to the camp, that in the camp, they celebrate the 100,000th killing of Jews from Warsaw with a special ration of alcohol and a special party that night to celebrate reaching that number. We see, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here because I want to give some time for questions. We also see that in the killing centers themselves, the picture below on the left is from Sobibor. This is from the Johann Niemann collection, which you can find in the Holocaust Memorial Museum archives, and as is the other photo, which is the Death Heads Guard at Sachsenhausen. You see this fellowships that's created as part of the life of the killers, and one thinks about Sobibor or Treblinka, and one thinks about what the smell must have been like, what the daily actions must have been like. But to see Sunday festivities involved in those, I think gives really another insight into the nature of the mentality of the killers. Now, coping is definitely, as I said before, if we were to look at the historiography of alcohol use, most historians have pretty much talked about alcohol as a coping mechanism. And it makes sense for a couple reasons. For the perpetrators, they could say that I could only do this if I drank. And after the war especially, it could be seen as a mitigating factor in the defense. It could also be seen as an alibi for their action. What I also believe is for most historians and normal people, we can't imagine that people would celebrate or use alcohol in a celebratory function when drinking. So for historians, it's been easier to accept the idea of coping as an explanation. And one of the things that I think that this book does very clearly is it complicates that view in a much more nuanced way and kinds of shifts some of that, the look away from alcohol merely as a coping mechanism. Starting to wrap up here, these are some of the insights that I gained during the process of doing the book, that alcohol was ubiquitous in the East, and it's been hiding in plain sight for historians over the course of the many years since the Shoah. We see that also alcohol was important in shared group identity, but very importantly, alcohol was neither necessary nor sufficient for killing. The Holocaust would have happened without alcohol, but its integration into acts of murder and killing, again, offers us insights into the minds of the perpetrator, just like their use of celebratory ritual, song and music, sexual violence, and trophies and trophy counting. And another point that I think is important to underline, that some of the Einsatzgruppen personnel, it's been talked about that they had psychosomatic manifestations related to killing, that they couldn't really go on. They had stomach aches, they couldn't sleep at night. However, when you look at people who are alcoholics and heavy alcohol use, what you also see is those are physiological effects of heavy drinking as well. So it again starts to potentially complicate that view. And one of the difficulties in looking at alcohol is the many functions that you have to disentangle. This slide is not related to this presentation, but it's a slide I would like to end with, because it's a slide from my earlier book on the police. And I can talk about perceptions or theories of masculinity and perpetrator motivation. But I think it's also important to remember that even our study of the Holocaust is about individuals. And this is a picture that gives me a photograph that reminds me it's about individuals. This is an SD man who's interrogating a young woman, and you see the young boy in the tattered clothing in a forest in the Soviet Union. And I don't know if that's her brother, her cousin, her son, but I do know the policeman standing behind her in that interrogation that was taking place. In many cases, tens of thousands of cases, that could have been the very last act in her life, right? Where she was found without papers in the forest and would be, and her and that little boy would have then shortly thereafter been killed. And so we talk about who's the 6 million and first victim. These are my 6,000,001 and 6,000,002, to remember that it's not about theory, it's about people. So having said that and talked for quite a bit, I'll stop sharing and go to questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Edward, for giving us insights to your really great presentation. And yeah, let's start the questions. Alessandro, Marta,
Yes.
yeah, you wrote maybe one question.
2 questions, but they became 3 questions during the conference. Previously, thank you for this very interesting lecture about an argument did not until now really studied like you had, and thank you for this. I want to ask you, Professor Westermann, we watched the any sort of I don't found the term, the exactly term in English, but there is a paradox in the Nazism, because in the salutist political of Nazism, there are the prohibition of the alcohol and the laws about against the alcoholism, and the chronic alcoholism, it was one of the motivation from which you can between 1939 1945 take away from your home and put in one of the fake hospitals of the X-24 and eliminated. But in front of this, in front of all of this, we have today an exactly number of the chronic alcoholists murdered in the X-24. How many there are? There are numbers or not in front of this really exception of the Nazism about the use of the alcohol and the using of the alcohol during the genocide. Another question is about the killing sprees in the ghettos. There were in the killing sprees only the Gestapo and the German authorities, or also local population that take part about these killing sprees. Why I ask this? Because we have some testimonies, in particular a testimony about one rictus among the nation, and about a man, a neighbor of this woman, that it was co-involved in this killing spree in the ghetto, that he go in the ghetto in night time to hunting and killing the Jews. Another question is about the trials. How many times the massive using of the alcohol was used by the perpetrators like a sort of excuse for the mass murder killings? Thank you.
Okay, those are great questions, Alessandro, and I'll try to answer them in the order you gave me. Certainly, there is the so-called Getränkefrage in Germany at the time. This idea of what Robert Proctor has called about the Nazi war on cancer, this progressive, quote unquote, look at alcohol and tobacco use as being harmful to the German body, if you will, and the Volksgemeinschaft. However, what one sees, right, is that's one of the paradoxes. You're an asocial, you're classified as asocial for excessive alcohol use, and those that are most asocial in their use of alcohol actually tend to be the SS and the police, right? The elite of the order. So I find that to be a paradox. And one sees that there are differences to a certain degree between the general German population and availability of alcohol during the war, especially, and in the East. For example, you have literally hundreds of thousands of bottles of French wine that are sent to the Eastern Front at different times during the war. Cognac, champagne, Bavarian beer is sent, right? So the idea that it's part of a prerogative or a perk for those who are the fighting or the perpetrators. The killing sprees, you're absolutely right about local populations being involved. I mean, if you look at Jan Kos in his discussion of Jedwabne, right, we see also alcohol that's involved in that action, right? And you also see in the literature, in some cases, Polish peasants who give up Jews, and it can be for a kilogram of sugar can be a reward. In some cases, it's also alcohol as a reward. And Hitler Youth, for example, there's a case of a Hitler Youth going into the ghetto and killing Jews. So those who are allowed or can get into the ghetto, certainly we see that. But again, that's primarily would be the German occupation authorities. And with respect to alcohol as an alibi, you often see it in police testimonies that I've looked at. Where you also see this is when Chris Browning looked at Police Battalion 101 in the book. Many of those Police Battalion 101 members talked about using alcohol as a coping mechanism, right? Again, this is post-war, which is really important, right? Because even during the war, alcohol, if you were convicted of a crime, alcohol could be a mitigating factor. So Volltrunkenheit, completely drunk, right, could get you partially off the hook for some of your actions under the Nazi regime and in SS and police courts, for example. So there's quite a lot to unpack there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking for another question. Maybe you can also leave your hand on blue.
I think Victor Santiago has his hands up.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Yes, I had a quick question. When you were researching and looking into the use or misuse of alcohol, in the Third Reich. And I understand that in Germany, it was considered not good morally to be an alcoholic and such. Did you ever run into the use of amphetamines mixed in with alcohol? Because I know amphetamines, at least even within our troops, was considered above criticism. It was a strength enhancer. But I do know in some of my readings, I've run across the mixture of amphetamines and alcohol as increasing violent behavior and sexual promiscuity, anxiety, things of that nature. Did you ever run into any of that?
Thank you. That's a great question, and some of you may be familiar with Norman Ohler's book "Blitzed" is the English title, where he looks at this idea of drug use in the Third Reich, and he is much more prescriptive in its effects, right? And what's really interesting to me is that alcohol is much more ubiquitous in things like Pervitin, for example, Panzerschokolade, right? That's used by the troops. And in fact, in the SS and police, I have never found a reference from Himmler, who writes about everything from sexually transmitted diseases to alcohol use to misuse of firearms to the use of drugs by the police. Now, Hadamar Schach, in his testimony at Nuremberg, tries to exculpate some of the good Nazis because they had to drink or use narcotics, as he writes. But I do not see that. I do not see that in the SS and police killing units. And my personal opinion is that argument is it's over-determined in Ohler's work, but I'm not the only historian who has said that. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, Rachel Green.
Thank you so much for taking my question. It's a little bit anecdotal, but my grandparents were both survivors from Poland, one from Zamość, the other from a town that's now part of Ukraine that was known as Ludmir in Yiddish and Wojciech in Polish. And both of them would share with me that in their experience, the Ukrainians were much more violent and dangerous and out of control than the Germans. And if they had to go to an office, there would maybe be a few SS men there, but dozens of Ukrainians, and they were drunk. And in some ways, in my own personal mythology, they were greater monsters. And I'm wondering whether your book covers those sort of, quasi-professional soldiers that the Germans would often hire or bribe, often with alcohol.
Yeah, Rachel, that's again another really excellent question. And one of the chapters looks at the auxiliaries, so the Schutzmannschaften and the local policemen. And you're absolutely right. What you see in the use of alcohol, and when we talk about the context of drinking, right? Poland, right? Vodka is the national drink of Poland in this period, right? Jews are tied to taverns, right? In Polish history, and there's anti-Semitism that's tied to Jewish tavern owners. But this idea of drinking hard or distilled liquor is part of that kind of culture, if you will. And Catherine Meridell looks at this with her discussion of the Red Army. We see some of the same processes. It's very hard drinking. Now, it does result when we look at places like Treblinka in Sobibor. We look at some of the Travniki who are involved, right? It's very clear that when they're drunk, they're violent. It's also very clear that some of these auxiliary police units that even the Germans say they get out of control if they have too much alcohol. Now, that's true, but I think a lot of what they're doing, we see many of the same things: celebratory ritual, music, or song. But in the case of song, it's normally like Lithuanian national songs that are sung, right? So, but it's still this celebration that takes place, sexual assaults that take place in this context as well. So I think they're modeling also German behavior, right? So they have German superiors whose behavior they've seen, and they're taking that model. Now, they may be taking it in some cases to a more extreme. But I think that's really difficult to untangle. And I think there's a little bit of a problem sometimes in doing that, because what it tends to do is we end up accepting kind of a Nazi view of race in the East, right? How 6 ounces of alcohol of vodka for somebody from Eastern Europe, they're not really drunk, right? You can see that in Nazi court findings, right? They don't get off the hook for what they did because that's normal for them, or that they're especially wild when they're drunk. So I think it becomes somewhat anecdotal. And I think, again, in thinking about that very question, one of the things I've relied on is also to think about these auxiliaries are operating under German control, and they're operating within the framework of a German occupation, where they're seeing these kinds of behaviors on the parts of the Germans, and they've expanded the bounds of acceptable behavior in that case. So I think, to me, it's a great question. I don't know, I can't give you a definitive answer, but that's what I kind of wrestled with a little bit myself.
Maybe, yeah, last question by Miriam Zimmermann.
Thank you for taking my question. And it has to do with if some sort of a miracle had happened and alcohol had been banned in Nazi Germany. After all, Hitler was a teetotaler. So absent alcohol, do you think that SS and Gestapo behavior would have been less violent? In other words, I'm trying to get a causal or a sort of a relationship with how you see the quantifying the relationship between alcohol and violent behavior.
Yeah, I think, Miriam, I think definitely the killing would have happened regardless of if there's alcohol or not. It's not necessary or sufficient for that, right? And it is kind of a paradox. Hitler doesn't drink; he takes bitters for like digestion, so he does take some alcohol. So there's a little mythology there. At the end of his life, there's talk in the bunker that he actually was drinking. But Himmler's another example of that. A guy who was in the Burschenschaft, in these German student fraternities, and he had to get a beer dispensation because he couldn't handle 2 tankards of beer, right? And these are guys that some of them will drink 1,000 liters of beer over the course of a year, right? So very much. So again, we have this kind of strange paradox in the leadership. But I do think it would have happened. And what's interesting to me, though, is I do agree that there were individuals who used alcohol as disinhibition, that allowed them to kind of go over a hurdle at some point. But that use of alcohol in the many different ways that included kind of like festivity, celebration, competition, right? I think it gives us a real insight into this kind of perpetrator mentality that we would otherwise be lacking, right? And I would also point out that probably the nearest example that I've looked at in a broader detail is if we look at the Rwandan genocide. We see some of the very same types of actions, use of Urwagwa, which is banana beer, festivities, meeting in the cabaret or the bar as well. So we see some of those kinds of same celebratory rituals in the perpetration of the Rwandan genocide as well.
Edward, thank you very, very much for your presentation, and maybe for all of you which are interested in buying his book. I saw that Emily Andrew had a promotion code, so don't hesitate to get Edward's new book in March 2021. Michal, maybe you will have some last words.
Yes, thank you. At first, I just wanted to thank again Edward Westermann for his remarkable presentation about again a very original topic, which is kind of hard to approach. But thank you for all the information you shared with us. We are kind of privileged to have an access your insights before the publication of your book that we heavily recommend, and we will of course be pleased to read it very soon. So thank you again, Edward, for this remarkable presentation, and thank you to all our audience for being connected again for this session of our online Beyond Memory program. I just wanted to close the session with an information. So we will have the last conference of our program next week. We will try to reproduce this program next year, but this one will be the last of the 7 conferences that we have. So, and next Thursday, on December 10th, we will have the pleasure to listen Todd Hennessy and Eva Schaller, who are head educators and who have also experience on the field in Eastern Europe, and they will talk about this experience that they had working with the neighbors of the crimes, and with the dealing also with the killing sites of the Holocaust by bullets. So thank you very much again, and we are looking forward to meeting you next week. We'll send you the invitations and links to register to the next conference on email, and of course it will be also available on our social networks. So thank you again, Edward.
Well, thank you, Michel. And if I could, just a final word. Last week, we lost a very close friend and Holocaust survivor, Dr. Theodore Zev Weiss from the Holocaust Educational Foundation. And I would just like, he's dedicated, he's one of the individuals that the book is dedicated to, but I'd just like to remember him for a second in front of this group that is so interested in Holocaust education. So thank you for the time, and it's been a pleasure, and I hope everyone has great holidays.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.